All right, welcome to the third and final video for our discussion on um, microbial organisms, the module on microbial organisms. And so this is basically all of the organisms that exist, kind of covering the large groups of these organisms, except for plants and animals. And so next week we'll get into plants, and then the following week we'll talk about animals. And so we're going to finish off this discussion with the kingdom fungi. Um, so the fungi kingdom is a very large grouping of organisms, over 100,000 species that have been identified. But it's been estimated that there's approximately 1 million species on Earth. So, we've only discovered about 10% of the fungal species. Um, Fungi, interestingly enough, are more closely related to animals than they are plants. Fungi are heterotrophic organisms. They're not photosynthetic. They have a cell wall that is made out of chitin. And chitin is this long carbohydrate polymer that you also find in things like the exoskeletons of insects and spiders and arthropods. And it helps to like waterproof those organisms to help prevent them from losing water. Um, and so the cell wall in fungi is made out of that same substance, helps serves as a structural support mechanism. Now, reproduction in fungi is very diverse as well, like we see with a lot of the other microorganisms. They can do asexual and sexual reproduction. Most fungi species produce what we call spores. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then they also are decomposers. So they are important again for breaking down organic material into its smaller components and helping to recycle nutrients back into the ecosystem and the biosphere. Fungi are often found in relationships and interactions with other organisms. So symbiotic relationships like a mutualism or a parasitism. So a mutualism is where both the fungi and the organism that it's interacting with is benefiting. So for example, plant roots. Fungi can help plant roots obtain water and nutrients more efficiently. Or it could be a parasitism where, say, the fungus is growing on an organism and is taking energy and nutrients away from the organism. So the relationship is negatively affecting the organism that the fungi lives on. And so these are some examples of fungi here. And so this is typically like one of your more commonly thought about organisms. Whenever you say the word fungus, you typically think of mushrooms. But you also can have fungi that appears in lots of different shapes. So these are the fruiting bodies of a coral fungus that's shown here. And then this is an electron micrograph that's showing the spores of another specific type of fungus that you find generally in soils and on plants. Now, fungi are eukaryotic cells. They have those complex cells that have the cell wall, they have a plasma membrane, they have organelles, membrane-bound nucleus, and so they have all of those characteristics that we talked about with eukaryotic cells, which is why they're found in the eukaryotic domain. And that cell wall, like we mentioned, is composed of chitin, and it serves as protection. And even though the fungi don't have chloroplasts, they still can have bright colors, like you see with this Animantia fungus, how it has that bright red color. And so they can be pigmented as well. And the pigments can protect from UV radiation, so they can help with the absorbance of that to help the structures from being damaged. But a lot of the fungi can also be toxic because of the different chemicals and pigments that they have. Fungi are usually non-modal, so they typically live in a sessile-like state, whether it's spores that are in the ground or whether it's filamentous fungi that, grow fruiting bodies. Um, and occasionally you can have the gametes that are um, modal. So for example, gametes of uh, chytrid fungus, it has a flagellum that allows it to move through the water. The morphology here, so the structure of fungi is typically they have a thallus, which is the vegetative body of the fungus. Um, they can be unicellular or multicellular depending on the species. So for example, yeast is a unicellular fungus. So remember, even though they're unicellular, they're still eukaryotic. Um, Multicellular fungi have two kind of life forms, two distinct morphologies. They'll have a vegetative state, which is the thallus, and then they'll have a reproductive state, which is typically the mushroom fruiting bodies that you see growing on the ground as you're like walking across your yard or whatever. And so here is the thallus structures of fungi. So these hyphae and mycelium components. And so a vegetative stage or the vegetative state, which is the thallus, um, and it's made up of these cells. Okay, so individual cells. So you can see in this image here, these different kind of blocked off structures are the cells. So those are your individual cells. And they're connected from end to end, like you see here. These cells make up filaments. So each of these individual filaments is made up of a cell. And each individual filament, like we see here, is referred to as a hyphae. Okay. Now, if you have a lot of these filaments put together, that's called a mycelium. So this mycelium is a thallus. It's the vegetative structure. And this mycelium is made up of hyphae, and the hyphae are made up of individual cells. Okay. So the hyphae are those singular tubular filaments for the fungus. And then the mycelium is a mass of hyphae. And that forms the body of a fungus. Okay. So it's the actual body of an organism. And like we see here, the hyphae are usually divided into separate cells, which are divided by end walls that are called septa or septum. And then there's small holes in the septum that allow for the flow of nutrients from one cell to another along the hyphae. Okay. And there are different categories of fungi. So Actinomycetes and Basidiomycetes, they have these cellular end walls. So they have the septae. Okay. Chytrids and zygomycetes are, I always butcher this word, but basically they're choanocytic, which means they have no distinction between the individual cells. So here you can tell where those cells are, right? You can tell the breakup. You can see where the septa are. And so that's the Actio and Basidiomycetes here. Chytrids and zygomycetes, you can't tell where those cells are broken up, right? If it wasn't for the individual nuclei, you wouldn't be able to tell that there are individual cells here. And so these filaments are long tubular filaments with cytoplasm lining this large vacuole center. Okay. And so these, remember, are part of the vegetative morphology. Okay. Then you have the reproductive morphology of fungi. And this is typically the portion of the fungus that you see growing above the ground. And the reproductive structures will produce spores, and they produce spores whether or not the fungi is producing sexually or asexually. Okay. The spores will then disperse, land on the ground, and grow a new parent fungus. They typically are wind blown, or they attach to an animal and then they'll fall to the ground, and then they'll grow into a new mature fungal adult. The sporocarp is a reproductive hyphae that's basically this large organized structure. And that's what we refer to as a mushroom. So a mushroom is just kind of a bunch of these hyphae forming this large organized structure like we see with this puffball mushroom here. And when this puffball mushroom matures, it will burst open and release all of the spores that were contained inside of that puffball mushroom. When those spores land on the ground, the sporangium will then grow the hyphae, which will then grow into a new adult. Okay, so you have your spores, your sporangium growing the hyphae. You can see that here. I think this is a piece of bread that the fungi is growing on. And then it grows into a sporocarp, which is what we see growing above ground. Okay. And again, the reproductive structures that are growing above ground, they can either reproduce sexually or asexually. So sexually would be whenever the hyphae of two different fungal organisms, fungal bodies, merge together to grow a mushroom. They'll exchange genetic material, grow spores, and then they will be blown away and turn into new adults. Sexually is whenever you have a single fungal body grow a sporiocarp, and it then produces spores. Okay. And so that's kind of the difference between asexual and sexual. The fungi, like we mentioned earlier, are heterotrophs. So basically they decompose organic compounds in the surrounding environment, and they absorb the nutrients. And so they secrete enzymes into the substrate that they're growing on or in, break those substances down, and absorb the nutrients that are released. And so again, they do this by growing through or within the substrates that they feed on. Most fungi are decomposers, and we refer to those as saprophytes. So they basically feed on that dead and decaying material along with other microorganisms. Some fungi are also parasitic, so they feed on living organisms without killing them. And then very few fungi actually capture prey, which we would refer to as predator fungal bodies, so predators. Fungi can be divided into four major divisions. We've already mentioned these divisions, but we're going to talk about them more here. So you have your Chytridomycota, which are your chytrid fungi, Zygomycota, which are bread molds, Ascomycota, which are your yeast and your sac fungi, and then Basidiomycota, which are your club fungi. Okay. There are also two other groups that are not classified as taxonomic groups, but we do recognize them as two groups of fungi. So Deuteromycota, which is fungi that are only asexually reproducing fungi. Then you have lichens, which is a fungi that has a mutualistic relationship between algae and cyanobacterium. Right, and so lichens will always have this fungal algae relationship. Okay. And that would be referred to as a lichen. Now, the placement of fungi into a division is based off of their reproduction mechanism, shape, and internal structure of the sporangia. Okay. So, for example, your chytrids are the only fungal groups that have motile spores. So these spores actually have a flagellum that will allow those spores to swim through aquatic environments. It's because of this, most of the chytrid fungus are aquatic. Okay, so they have to have a small film of water which those spores can swim through. Very few chytrids reproduce sexually. Most are asexually. and they basically unite spores of different mating types for these types of fungal groups. Chytrid fungus or fungi are a big fungal topic group, especially today, well, in general, but you may have heard of chytrid fungi because of their effects on frogs, especially tropical species. They are decimating frog populations. Basically, this chytrid fungus will grow on the surface of the skin, and I think it affects the way the frogs can get oxygen and absorb oxygen through their skin, and it ends up killing the individual, and so it's drastically affecting frog populations, especially in tropical areas. And so here's just a representation of a chytrid life cycle, where you would have fertilization of two spores, so of female and male gamete, that would lead to a zygote that would then grow into um, your chytrid fungus. Okay, so you don't have to memorize this life cycle, but just to let you know what it looks like. Your zygomycetes, they contain sporangia, which are hollow structures that will have spores that are produced through asexual reproduction. Okay. They also can reproduce sexually if the environmental conditions are poor and are causing stressful environments where asexual reproduction is not advantageous. And um, there are forms of zygomycetes that are resistant to freezing and drying, which is generally bad for trying to store food. So this is an example of a zygomycete here. And so here's a typical life cycle where you have asexual reproduction, so spores germinating and then growing into new adults. But then you also can have different mycelia that will basically connect with one another, and they do it by different mating types. We classify these by different mating types, and so you have a positive mating type and a negative mating type. So the opposites can mate and produce a fruiting body that will develop spores through the sporangium that will then germinate. They could either reproduce asexually, or they can reproduce sexually through that positive negative. Plasmogamy is what it's referred to, so the fusion of those opposite mating types. Acetiomycetes, these contain ascus, which are these sac-like structures that contain spores from sexual reproduction. So this is these mushroom-based structures that we see here, which we also find in basidiomycetes. They can reproduce asexually. They vary in size. They could be unicellular or multicellular. So for example, yeast is a form of unicellular. They affect plants dramatically. So there's lots of different plant pathogens that are affected by acetiomycetes. And then they also are, big form of decomposers, and they form symbiotic relationships, lots of symbiotic relationships. So we'll talk about some of these in a couple of slides. And so here's an example of those life cycles. And so this is the ascosospores. So that sac-like structure that has the spores from sexual reproduction here that we're seeing. So there's the ascus there. And then they also can reproduce asexually as well. And then we have these basidiomycetes that lead to the basidiocarp, which are the big mushroom-like structures that you see on the landscape. Okay, and so the basidium are these club-shaped structures that bear the spores. So underneath these structures are gills, which we'll look at in the next slide, and those gills have and contain the spores that are used to generate new individuals. Most of these are decomposers. These include things like mushrooms, puffballs, shelf fungi. So this is an example of shelf fungi here. You got two examples of mushrooms here. And then again, here's just a typical life cycle for for these basidiocarps. And again, sexual reproduction mostly because you have the fruiting bodies growing above ground. So just the opposite type through plasmogamy fusing together, growing that reproductive structure, leading to the development of the spores. And so those spores are found underneath the mushroom itself, so in the gills is what we call it. So here's a mushroom turned upside down. Here's the gills, and if you zoom in a microscopic image, you can see all of the spores that you would find on these gills that when are mature will be released to generate and grow into adult organisms. So a lot of fungi will produce plant pathogens. So for example, you have mold on a grapefruit here, fungus on grapes, you have mildew, powdery mildew mold on zinnia, which is a flowering plant. And then you have stem rust, which is a fungus here, which is on barley. Then when you also have ergot, which is on rye, which is what we see here, this kind of dark looking fungal structures that are growing. You also get what's called rust and smuts, which is that dark looking color on corn plants, and then these big bodies that grow on the ears of corn. So those are all fungal based pathogens. And then you can have animal and human pathogens from fungus as well. So mycosis is where you just get a fungal infection. A lot of them are superficial, so on the skin, which was what we would call cutaneous. They can be systemic, which means they spread to internal organs. So like here would be a fungal infection in the lungs. And so you can kind of see these speckled areas of a fungus growing inside of the lungs there. And they typically are opportunistic, which means that they're basically just normal fungal organisms that becomes pathogenic because opportunity prevents itself, and it becomes just beneficial for the fungus to do so. And we briefly mentioned symbiosis earlier, where it's just relationship between two organisms of a different species, where they're generally, at least one organism is dependent on the other. And so you can have predation and parasitism, where there's a negative and a positive effect. So predation, for example, and parasitism, one organism is negatively affecting the other to get a gain. Commensalism is basically a positive and no effect. So like a bird nest in a tree. So the birds have a place to live inside the tree, but it's not really affecting the tree in any way. Then you have a mutualism, which is basically a positive effect. So both organisms are gaining from the relationship. And this is kind of what we're going to focus on here for the last part of the video. It's just a mutualistic relationship that fungi have, especially with plants. And so mycorrhizae are a fungal mycelium that has a symbiotic relationship with plant roots. And so fungus has a very huge, very large surface area. And so because it has a large surface area, it allows it to take up a lot of nutrients and a lot of water whenever it rains, right? And if the roots are associated with that fungi, then all of a sudden the plants have access to an increased amount of water and nutrients. And so basically what happens is you have this mutualistic relationship between plants and fungi, where the fungi will basically grow out of the roots. So here you have a root with a fungal mantle that's surrounding that root with mycelium growing out, right? And the plant will provide energy sugars, so carbohydrates, to the fungi through photosynthesis. And then the fungus will give the plant access to a much larger area of water and nutrient uptake. Okay? So for example, this is the rhizosphere, so the area where the roots are getting nutrients and water with only the roots from the plant. But then if you include the rhizosphere from the roots and the fungal hyphae, all of a sudden that rhizosphere is much larger than what it would originally be, right? So this is kind of artistic drawing of that relation. So you can see the roots here, and you can see all of the fungal hyphae growing off of those roots, increasing the surface area that that plant has access to dramatically. And so it's very beneficial for the plants to have access to more nutrients and water. And if the plant can produce more carbohydrates, then it doesn't mind giving the fungi some of those carbohydrates if that means it gets more for itself. Okay. And then one of the last things we're going to mention are lichens. So remember we said lichens are this mutualistic relationship between fungi and algae. And so it's basically where you have this upper cortex of fungal hyphae, so right here, which provides protection. And then you have this algae that lives next to that fungal cortex, and that's where all of the photosynthesis occurs. Okay? And then you have all of this fungal hyphae down below. And the algal layer is basically providing food for both groups. And then the fungal hyphae is providing protection, grabbing moisture, getting minerals, and also serving as a source of attachment for that algae layer. And so they're both benefiting in this relationship dramatically. And so this is why, they have this mutualistic relationship, because they do better together. Here's an example of a crustose lichen. So basically crusty lichen that's growing on rocks here. So this orange looking color. This is a foliose lichen. So basically a leafy lichen. Probably have seen these on plants, a lot growing in moist areas. And then this is a shrubby lichen, which is known as a fructose lichen. So just kind of another type of lichen that you could see. And so just to end up this module, we just want to talk about the importance of the kingdom of fungi real quick. So basically, fungi are important, as we've talked about, for decomposition. Decomposition is important because it's recycling all of those nutrients throughout ecosystems. They also are very important for the mutualistic relationships that they have with plants and the mycorrhizae that they provide. Fungi also produce a lot of different drugs we rely on, so like penicillin and antibiotics. They also provide food and the production of other types of substances that we use in the generation of things we consume. So like beer and champagne rely on fermentation and fungal bodies for the production, yeast for bread. And then we also eat mushrooms and truffles, right? They are important because they affect humans and plants with all of the diseases that they bring about. So understanding fungus or fungi and how they work and their evolutionary history is really important for understanding how to combat these diseases. And then there are also model organisms. We can use them in studies. That's what basically model organisms are, kind of these prime organisms we can use to understand relationships and understand science and genetics and molecular biology especially. And so yeast is one of those model organisms that we use from the fungal group. And so fungi is a really important kingdom that serves a lot of different it's important in a lot of different ways throughout their ecosystems and interactions, especially with humans. And so that's it for our module 12. We'll pick up next week in our next module with module 13, where we'll start looking at the next kingdom, which is the plant kingdom, and then kind of move on from there. And so, yeah, I hope you have a good rest of your week, and we will see you in the next module.